show that countries that have two or more official languages have lower incidence of dementia, of Alzheimer's at the national level, with actually a direct correlation between the number of languages spoken in the country and the incidence of dementia. So the more languages spoken officially in the country, the lower the incidence of dementia.
So hello and welcome to the Sheekey Science Show, where in this video I spoke with Viorica Marian, Professor of Psychology at Northwestern University and is the Principal Investigator of the Northwestern Bilingualism and Psycholinguistics Research Laboratory. Most recently, Professor Marian published her excellent book, The Power of Language, which I read earlier this year, that discusses how languages change the way we perceive the world as well as the benefits of bilingualism. Here we discuss many of these topics and more. I hope you enjoy. So, hi, Viorica. Thank you so much for joining me today and welcome to the Sheekey Science Show.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. So, I wanted to reach out to you because earlier this year I read your book, The Power of Language, and I thought it was amazing. And then I just knew I had to have a conversation with you about it. But I think initially...
Thank you so much. That means a lot to me.
Thank you. And so I think initially the reason I picked it up as a book to read was for many reasons. One is that it mentioned discussing about the connection with language and memory and the way we perceive the world around us. Also because it talks about the benefits of bilingualism. And at the time and still currently, I'm trying to learn Japanese. So I read it for that reason, as a bit of motivation. And then lastly, as a biologist, I'm fascinated by the question of how cells communicate, how our tissues communicate with each other. And I thought maybe I'll glean some insight from reading this book. So I think that somewhat leads on to my first question, which is what actually are the key components that make up a language?
Oh, that's a seemingly easy question, but it really isn't. So most of the time when we think about language, we think of the natural languages that people speak, like you and I now are speaking in English. So we think of English, or you mentioned Japanese. And incidentally, the Japanese edition of the book is coming out next week.
Ah,
so
nice.
I'm very excited about that. It has a beautiful cover. But yeah, so most of the time people think about natural human languages and sort of stop at that. But what is a language very much depends on the definition we use, how we define language. The way I think about language, or one way to think about language, is as a symbolic system that allows us to use symbols to encode information, transmit it over space and time, and then decode it at the other end. And if we use that definition of a language as a symbolic system, then natural languages that people speak are not the only ways not the only types of languages out there. We also have artificial languages. Usually people think about that as computer languages, but there are other artificial languages as well that are being created in books and movies for research as well. Some consider math a language because math uses numbers as symbols to communicate, to encode information. Some consider music a language, again, because you use symbols to transmit information like sound over space and time. So the definition of language that I use in the book is much broader.
I see. And so what got you interested in languages in the first place? What is it that fascinates you about it?
Well, to start with, I grew up with more than one language. So I grew up in Eastern Europe with Romanian as my native language and Russian being the official language of the country I lived in at the time, which was one of the former Soviet republics. And then I studied English in school, and then French in college, and then Spanish around myself, and then I married into a Dutch family. So I was being exposed and learning multiple languages, and I was noticing that when I was using these different languages, they changed the way I interacted with the world in interesting ways. And when I try to read more about this, I noticed that there isn't really much about multilingualism, bilingualism, people who speak multiple languages. Most of the research on language was from the perspective of monolingualism, people who only speak one language. I was, as a teenager, very interested in philosophy. So at some point, I thought I might go the philosophy route, but instead, I went the cognitive psychology route and cognitive science route, and became interested in the relationship between language and mind, and how language and mind are interconnected, how one influences the other, specifically from the point of view of people who speak multiple languages, really using bilingualism and multilingualism as a way to get insight and get information you cannot get about language and mind when you only look at one language and speakers of one language only. So I started doing research on bilingualism and multilingualism, eventually starting a bilingualism and multilingualism lab. My first restudy on bilingualism and multilingualism was actually as an undergraduate nearly 30 years ago now. My first presentation was about gestures in bilingual speakers and how people who speak multiple languages use different gestures and different nonverbal communication when they switch languages. So after many years of doing empirical research on bilingualism and publishing it in research journals, peer-reviewed journals, I wanted to bring this work to a broader audience outside the laboratory, outside academia, where only a small number of people reads it, and try to make it accessible and bring accurate information to a general audience, people who speak two or more languages, but really society at large, because I do think that it tells us a lot about um, the human capacity for language, about learning, about thinking, about human potential in general. So that's a long answer to your question, but I hope it gives you some insight into where I'm coming from.
Yeah, for sure. And so I think one of the facts that surprised me when I read your book initially was the fact that there are more bilingual, multilingual people in the world than monolinguals, like I guess myself, although I'm trying to become bilingual. So that initially shocked me. And then what you then go on to talk about is all the benefits that are associated with knowing more than one language. And so would you be able to discuss what some of these findings show?
Yes, sure. I will pull back a little bit by saying that even though you think of yourself as a monolingual, I guess if we use that broader definition of language, where it's not just natural languages and you also use math and you also maybe use music, you're not as monolingual as you think,
Thank
because
you.
each of those symbolic systems change the way you think. And you can, think about how math changes the way people can construct knowledge, make discoveries, advance scientifically. Um, Literacy, when you learn to read, your brain, your mind is changed. In the same way, learning another language changes how our brain and our mind work. So it's not surprising that with the acquisition of a new symbolic systems, you're going to see some consequences. And these consequences are present throughout the lifetime, from the very earliest age, from babies and infants, through young adulthood, and then through old age. So there are so many changes, just because the effects are pervasive, that it would take hours to talk about all of them. So I'll just select a few throughout the lifespan. I'll start with babies, to say that when we are born, we can hear the sounds of all of the world's languages. We are, metaphorically speaking, citizens of the world. But then, throughout the first months and years of life, our language systems become tuned to the sounds of our native language and the languages that we are exposed to. And eventually, we are no longer sometimes even able to hear the distinctions that exist in other languages and don't exist in our native languages. So languages vary in the number of vowels they have, number of consonants they have. And the most famous examples of that, I think, in Western nations are perhaps how speakers of Spanish sometimes have difficulties with the B and the V sound, or speakers of Japanese sometimes have difficulties with the R and L sounds. Of course, English speakers also have difficulties with a lot of sounds of other languages, like some of the Scandinavian vowels, for example. Um, what's interesting is that when you are a bilingual or multilingual baby, you keep that window, that perceptual window, open for a longer period of time. Um, so that's one of the consequences of being exposed to multiple languages from an early age. Then, so this is in infancy. Then in childhood, there is some evidence that children who grow up with two or more languages um, develop metalinguistic and metacognitive abilities a bit earlier than children who grow up with one language only. And what metalinguistic ability refers to is the ability to reason about language. And I'll give you an example. When you are a bilingual or multilingual child, you know that the same object can have multiple name. So, for example, I can call this a pen, or I can call this stilo, or I can call this ruchka, and it doesn't change the entity, the item itself. So, from an earlier age, bilingual children, multilingual children understand that the object and its name are not one and the same, that they are separate, and you can use different names to refer to the same object. So this is this ability to reason about language. Uh, of course, monolinguals eventually develop it as well, but they tend to develop it a bit later. So that's one of the consequences in childhood. Then when we move through adulthood, one of the most studied consequences of bilingualism and multilingualism is the executive function component of cognition. So executive function is really a set of skills. It encompasses multiple abilities in cognitive control, inhibition, facilitation. And it seems that people who speak two or more languages show some, on some of the components of executive function, they outperform monolingual speakers, especially people who are older at the different sort of the developmental ends of the continuum, earlier in childhood and later in adulthood. And the argument there is that because bilinguals and multilinguals constantly use two or more languages, they have a lot of experience facilitating the language they are using and inhibiting the other languages that are not being used at that point in time. So right now we're speaking in English. We have to focus on facilitate and privilege English, and not use any of the Japanese you may know, or any of the French or Spanish or Dutch or whatever other languages I may know, and really stay with English. And this constant experience with language, with um, controlling our languages, translates to changes to executive function beyond language and other domains of cognition. I should say that the literature on executive function in bilinguals is not very clear cut. It's controversial. These findings have been challenged, so not every experiment finds that bilinguals outperform monolinguals. And sometimes people get up in arms about it, but I don't think we should be really throwing the baby out with the bathwater, as they say, because the right way to ask the question is what aspects of executive function are changed by what aspects of bilingualism, multilingualism, and under what circumstances. And what I mean by that is bilingual experience is not this monolithic thing. There are multiple kinds of bilinguals or multilinguals. They differ in how they learn their languages, the ages in which they learn at which they learn their languages, how fluent they are, which language is dominant, what settings they use their languages, how recently they've used their languages, how similar the languages are, how many languages they have. This is just a tiny fraction of variables on which bilinguals and multilinguals differ. So clearly, if we would have to really understand what aspects of bilingualism matter. Similarly, executive control is not this one thing. There are, as I mentioned before, lots of different components to it. And you're likely to see effects show up in some environments and circumstances and not in others, depending on who you are interacting with, what languages you are using. It's almost a little bit like exercise. We generally assume and know, and there is so much convincing evidence that exercise is beneficial, exercise is good for you, but that doesn't mean that all kinds of exercise are good for all types of, let's say, health outcomes. We would really want to understand what kind of exercise benefits what kind of health measures. So in the same way, language experience is in a way exercise for your brain. And so understanding what aspects of that exercise benefit what type of cognitive processes is a more accurate way of asking those questions. And they don't just apply to executive function, they apply to behavioral research in general. People differ, we are not all the same. So we've talked about infancy, childhood, adulthood. I'll give you one example of consequences of bilingualism and multilingualism later in life, and that's dementia, Alzheimer's and other types of dementia. And there is evidence that knowing two or more languages delays the onset of Alzheimer's and other types of dementia by 4 to 6 years, depending on the study. And there are now also national level studies that show that countries that have two or more official languages have lower incidence of dementia, of Alzheimer's at the national level, with actually a direct correlation between the number of languages spoken in the country and the incidence of dementia. So the more languages spoken officially in the country, the lower the incidence of dementia. So it seems that the effects of bilingualism and multilingualism are really pervasive for the individual and for societies at large.
Yeah.
So I'll stop there. But of course, anyone who is interested can dig in deeper into the research. There are so many research articles published in scientific journals all over the world. There are laboratories doing research on bilingualism and multilingualism on every single continent in almost every country. So there is a lot more to be said on this topic.
Yeah, for sure. No, that was a fascinating coverage. And I think one point I want to sort of follow up with is on this channel, I think obviously my background being in biology and sort of aging research, I'm fascinated by ways in which we can prevent things like dementia. And so naturally, findings like that is super striking. And so to what extent can we actually explain why things like being bilingual, multilingual might be able to prevent dementia?
Yeah, that's a good question. This research is still in its infancy. It was pioneered by Ellen Ballistock in Canada, who was the first to find out and to discover that individuals who are bilinguals and bilingual or multilingual are diagnosed with Alzheimer's and dementia later than monolinguals. And the interesting thing there is not that bilinguals and multilinguals don't develop dementia, that their brains don't deteriorate. They do. What happens is that they compensate functionally for the anatomical deterioration. So if you look at a bilingual brain and monolingual brain with the same level of impact of deterioration, the bilingual brain is able to function at a higher level cognitively than the monolingual brain. And then the flip side of that is, of course, that individuals who function cognitively at the same level, their brains are actually in different states. So what happens there, it seems that bilinguals are compensating by using the connections that have been built over time in their other language or languages. And one way to explain that is, imagine if you always take the same bridge or the same road home over the years. And you go to work, you come back, you always take the same road. And then one day you come home, and on the way home, you see that that road has collapsed. If there are no other ways to reach home, if that's the only road or that exists, then you are in trouble. You can never reach home again in a way. But if there are other roads and other bridges that have been built over time, and of those roads and bridges, you just reroute and take another route, and you still reach your destination. In the same way, the connections that have been built at the neural level between your language and your experiences, your memories, um, your sort of life experiences over the years now have other connections that have been built that can potentially allow you to compensate for the anatomical deterioration that you may be experiencing. So it's one of those use it or lose it, and richness of neural connections explanations that seem to be accounting for that. But we are only at the beginning of this field, and the research in this area is still very much happening. And as new tools are being developed, new statistical analysis tools, new brain imaging tools, we are gaining a better understanding of what exactly learning and using multiple languages does for brain health.
No, I think it's definitely worth pursuing it further. And I mean, I guess maybe we don't have the answer at the moment, but obviously, is it true that different languages they differ in their complexity, and maybe there are certain languages that would have even more benefits than others? Or do you think it's more based on like the number of languages one might be able to speak?
I don't know that we can say that one language is better than another. It comes down to the type of language experience. Sometimes when you learn languages that are more different, it allows you to learn more new information. So that can be beneficial. Other times when you learn languages that are more similar, you get a bigger workout because it's harder to control competitions between languages that are more similar. So if you are, for example, an English speaker who's learned, let's say, Spanish and is fluent in Spanish, and then attempts to learn, let's say, Italian or French or Portuguese or Romanian or any other Romance language, you can often find that, Spanish tends to pop up when you're trying to use your new Romance language, and it takes more effort to control more similar languages. So it really depends on the type of the experiences, fluency as well, how we learn our different languages. But no, one language, as of now, we cannot say that one language is better than another.
I see. Yeah, that makes sense. And so it seems like one benefit of being bilingual or multilingual is maybe preventing dementia. But is it true that another potential benefit is being more creative in the thought process?
That's a, also a very good question. You hit on all the really important and interesting points, and I'm glad. There is some evidence, increasingly so, that being bilingual or multilingual boosts creativity, and we are now conducting research in the lab precisely to look at this question. This is a relatively new area for us, but we are finding that people who speak two or more languages see items that are not related as more related than monolinguals. That they can make connections between things that people who don't speak multiple languages can't. The way we're currently explaining that, there are a couple of explanations. One is that each concept has multiple features that contributes to it. So for example, if you think of what is a bike in English, you may think of things like wheels and handlebars and exercise and gym. If you think of a bike in Dutch, you will have some features that are shared with English, like wheels and handlebar, but perhaps instead of gym, you are more likely to think transportation, or you're more likely to think about, having a basket on it and traffic. And then if you speak French, you may have uh, still some things that overlap with both English and Dutch, like wheels and handlebar, but then other components that only overlap with one language, maybe basket, and then unique components, again, like a baguette, which is a French stereotype, but for the ease of conversation here, we'll use that. So a person who speaks multiple languages, their mental representation of bike differs. And now you have all these connections, where, you may have a connection between baguette and exercise or basket or whatever, that is stronger because of the coactivation that this concepts experience in the bilingual, multilingual mind. So your representations of this concept is different than if you don't speak those languages. So another example is that in some languages, the same word can translate onto two different words in another language. And then when you are a speaker of those languages, and those two concepts that share translation are represented closer in your mind. So you are able to see connections between things. And this is at the level of meaning, but you also have more similarities at the level of form. So if two words share form, they are more likely um, to be represented as more similarly in one's mind. And we often experience that where the wrong word pops up because it sounds so similar to another word. Speakers of multiple languages experience that often, where if they hear a word in one language and it sounds very similar as a word in another language, it makes them think of that word and it reminds them of associated concepts. So this experience is so frequent. We've actually done quite a few studies using eye tracking, recording people's eye movements, that show that people who speak multiple languages, when they hear one word, they make eye movements to objects that have a name that sounds similar in those other languages. So I'll give you an example. If you're an English speaker and you hear the word marker, and if I tell you to pick up a marker and I record your eye movements, if there are marbles on the table, you make eye movements to the marbles because marker and marbles sound similar. You're not aware of them. They happen in fractions of, a millisecond, this very quick saccadic eye movements. But there it is. It shows that both are coactivated in parallel. Now, if you speak Spanish and you hear marker, if you're Spanish bilingual and there is a butterfly flying around and the Spanish word for butterfly is mariposa, and you hear marker, you're likely to make eye movements to the mariposa because you share the two words share word onset. If you speak Russian and there is a stamp on the table, on the desk, and the Russian word for stamp is marka, you're going to make eye movements to the stamp. So you have this closer relationship between words. And I just now inadvertently produced one of those examples where I use the word table instead of desk, because in the native languages that I know, there is only one word for desk and table, and it's masa. So the two words desk and table are represented much closer in my mind than in the mind of an English speaker. So creativity, one of the components of creativity is seeing connections and making connections and connecting things that other people don't see as connected, which is what we think is one of the contributing mechanisms that explains why children and adults who speak two or more languages often score higher on many creativity tasks.
Oh, interesting. You've definitely made me want to keep sticking with this Japanese learning for sure. And speaking of like just learning a language, obviously you can speak multiple languages. What evidence or like to what extent or what are the best ways to actually go about learning a language? I know that there are various different methods that are purported, and also claims that once you learn one language, it's very easy to learn other languages. So, from your experience and what you've read, to what extent is this true?
Yeah, it is true. So bilinguals are better at learning a third language than monolinguals at learning a second language. And it seems like with each language you learn, it becomes easier and easier to learn new languages. And people used to think and say, well, some people are just better at learning languages. That's why they become bilingual in the first place. That's why they become trilingual and multilingual in the first place. And that's certainly true. There is some component of that. There is this theory of multiple intelligences where people vary in how good they may be at learning a new language or at math or at music and at sports. So that's a contributing variable. But it doesn't tell the whole story. It doesn't explain, for example, why everyone in the Quebec area of Canada is a fluent Spanish English bilingual. Not everyone, but why there are more more bilinguals in Quebec than there are in the northeastern part of the United States. So Quebec is a bilingual province by law, so children have to study both languages in school. So it doesn't explain this geographical bilingualism. It seems that with each new language you learn, there is less new information to learn in yet another language. And the way I can explain this is basically if you think of a Venn diagram. The first time you learn a language, you learn this entire circle with all new information, sounds, rules, grammar, mapping form to meaning, all of that. Then when you've already gotten that down and you learn a second language, you already have a lot of that information and you still learn some new information in this other circle, but it's not an entirely new circle. Some of that will overlap. Then when you learn a third language, some of the new information you learn in the third language overlaps with the first language, some with the second, some with both, and only a little bit more information is completely new. So with each new language, there is less new information in the way that you learn. So that's part of the explanation. Another part of the explanation is that you do get better at learning. You've already gone through this before. You're better at controlling competition from your native language already. Your system is attuned to knowing what to pay attention to. So, it's like a virtuous cycle where learning begets more learning. The more you learn, the easier it becomes to learn, and the faster you can advance in learning another language and potentially beyond language and learning in general. As for your other question, what's the best way to learn another language? The real answer to that is that the best way to learn another language is to find the approach that works the best for you. And I know it seems like it's not the answer that we're looking for, but it's the same kind of answer as one would give if you're being asked, what's the best way to exercise? Or what's the best way to invest? There are some general principles that apply, but in the end, what will work is if adopting a system that you'll be able to stick with long term, that will allow you to be systematic, committed, regular, and not just sort of like a flash in a pan kind of thing. If you find an approach that works for you, that you enjoy, that you can incorporate in your life, then you're more likely to stick with it and to use it and to become fluent. So people vary in approaches they use. So some people would use different languages on different days of the week. So even households, if there are bilingual parents, maybe they use the father's language on Monday, the mother's language on Tuesday, the broad society language on Wednesday, a foreign language they want to learn on Thursday. This is if you're being very ambitious. But there are lots of different ways to do it. Another way could be to use the one parent, one language approach, which people often use. So mom always speaks one language, dad always speaks another language. Or another approach might be to use the heritage language in the home, only the language, the heritage language of the family, and then the language that's the dominant language in the society outside the home when you're raising children. When you are trying to learn another language as an adult, well, right now, apps are very popular and they actually work quite well because they capitalize on what we know about the reward circuit in the brain,
Yes.
and they are built in a form of a game almost. So you get this little reward every time you do something right, and it allows you to advance levels. So it seems to work, and a lot of people are finding those ways very effective. Immersion is a very effective way to learn another language, either by travel or studying in another country. Developing relationships with people who speak multiple languages is also a wonderful way to improve your social interactions, which are so important for mental health, physical health, lots of different things. So just trading language lessons. So if you're learning Japanese, if you find a Japanese speaker who wants to learn English, and you interact with them, even online. Of course, in person is great, but right now the internet makes it possible to interact with people all over the world, and sort of trading that. You can independently learn on your own, but then communicating with each other is an excellent way to learn another language. My brother was trading Swedish and English lessons more than 10 years ago with another student. And the outcome of those lessons being traded is that the Swedish person with whom he traded language lessons has now been my sister-in-law for more than 10
Oh,
years.
wow.
So you never know where those lessons can lead. But really, whatever you enjoy, finding what makes. So I used to have a PhD student in the lab who always had all his devices set to French, all the interfaces, all the settings. Whenever he used a computer, phone, TV, it was all in French to help him, keep up with his French. Or watching movies, listening to music without subtitles. Really, whatever makes you happy, whatever works for you. If this is a source of joy and pleasure, and not, yet another thing that you have to do, then you're much more likely to become successful. And even if you won't be fluent, it will improve your quality of life because you'll do something you enjoy and that makes you happy.
Yeah, no, I can. Well, first, I can vouch for the apps. So I'm a Duolingo, and I definitely don't want to break my streak at the moment. But also, you're right with the immersion and just communicating with people who speak that language. So the reason I chose Japan was I was in Japanese even was I was in Japan this summer, so I did get to try and have some in person communication. And I think from my side it was I always love to learn from people, and obviously I can speak English, but if I can speak their language as well, then I can understand their way of life and understand how they see things and their explanations. And as you said, the sort of social benefits for mental health. And I think that someone somewhat leads on to like psycholinguistics, or at least I think maybe I'm wrong, but I believe that's more your interest, the cognitive psychology associated with languages. And I think although we've spoken about some concepts already, what are some of the major findings in this field that you've been associated with?
Yeah, so we are really doing a nice job touching on multiple topics in the book, of course. And then the book goes into all of this into much more depth. But yes, so I'm really interested in the psychology of language and how the language we use shapes the way we think, how language and mind mutually influence each other, how they interact. Um, There is the famous Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. Does language shape thought? Is our thought limited by the words we have to refer to things? Can we think about something if we don't have labels and language and words for it? These are some of the broader philosophical questions that we're interested in. What comes first, thought or language? Is another one. And how do we know? Because most of the time we study thought through language. We need to have words to even label our findings. Many of the discoveries that have been made in multiple fields of science become possible or facilitated by having the language to use to refer to those concepts. So many words did not exist just a few decades or of course centuries ago. We are constantly discovering new knowledge and having words and labels, putting labels in place. So our language and the way our words can be a bit of a, it can function as a prism through which we see reality and the world around us. And the reality that you see and that I see and that, your listeners see, are shaped by our languages. There is a lot of research on that. And it's not, I don't want to take a fully deterministic approach. I know that many do, where they just say, language determines thought. If you don't have a word, you can't have that concept. But it does shape the way we think. It does influence our thoughts. And this has been studied in many domains. The most famous one is color, for example, where people who have multiple words for color think of color differently, remember color differently. For example, there is research with Greek and Russian speakers where there are two different labels for light and blue, light blue and dark blue.
Okay.
And speakers of those languages who have two labels for light blue and dark blue make decisions about different shades of blue much faster, or remember images of different shades of blue much faster than people that only have one um, shade of blue in one label for different shades of for all shades of blue in their language. With color, the way to illustrate that is to use the rainbow as an example, because most of the time when we think about the rainbow, we think of the colors of the rainbow through the prism of our language. And if our language has 6, 7, 8, however many colors we grew up thinking of the rainbow having, and as kids we drew the rainbow with the colors that we knew the rainbow has, then that's what we think a rainbow is. But in reality, the rainbow has an infinite number of colors, each color changing into another by just one pixel. There is just, the full color spectrum is represented in the rainbow. So this is one illustration of how our labels and our languages influence our perception and how we see and how we think about color. But color is not the only way, not the only example. Language influences how we think about time, how we think about mass, how we think about emotions, how we think about relationships. There are languages that have different words for different types of relationships, different types of love, different emotions. And that changes how we think, who we are, how we interact with the world. I know this is like we are nearing the end of the conversation when we broach this topic, but this is like an entire other field with classes being taught, books being written on this topic, on how language shapes thought, and how the two interact, how thought shapes language as well. The two definitely go hand in hand, it seems like. And there are so many other areas of research within the psychology of language field right now. We're doing some work on sound symbolism. So is the form completely arbitrary from disconnected from meaning, or are there some consistent patterns between the form of words and language and the meaning they carry? This is another highly contested area of research, and I'm happy to go into as much or as little of it as you'd like, but I'll let you direct the conversation in whatever direction you'd like it to go.
Oh no, I mean for sure I'd be interested to hear in more detail about some of these studies. Because I think from my side I really do think I'm interested in this topic, partly because as a scientist we write in English our journals. I mean, obviously I'm English anyway, so that's great. But we're trying to describe our findings, and I feel like if we don't have the vocabulary to actually be able to do that, then are we somehow limiting the progress that we can make in the field? And so yeah, no, I'd be definitely interested to hear more of your studies.
Yeah, that's a really good insight, and it's a whole other new direction that you've mentioned just now. How the fact that most scientific research is being published in English, is being conducted on English speakers, and not just English speakers, but a relatively small portion of the populations. What I will refer to as weird population, Western educated, industrialized, rich and democratic nations. So the majority of research and researchers come from weird nations. But this is only a small the minority of the world's population. And what happens as a result is we are leaving this huge segment of humanity out of research, which gives us an incomplete and inaccurate understanding of humanity, mind, brain, potential, all of that. If we're only looking at certain kind of speakers, we don't get a full understanding of what we are capable of as humans. One of the parallels I make when I talk about this is to the field of medicine, where historically most research, for example, on heart disease and diabetes was done on white men. But now we know that heart disease manifests differently in women, and diabetes manifests differently in populations indigenous to North and South America. So if we don't include women, or if we don't include populations indigenous to North and South America in research, then we don't get a full understanding of diabetes or heart disease, or mechanisms driving those conditions and ways to treat them, and really don't have a full understanding of those medical phenomena. In the same way, if we just look at monolinguals, if we just look at English speakers or weird populations, we don't have a full understanding of how language works, how the mind works. And in scientific research, it leaves out this potential that imagine how much further science could be if we included and if it was not limiting to just a very small portion of population.
Yeah, no, exactly. This is something that from reading your book really made me think about, especially as well. See, I do a lot of science communication. It's something I always think about. All my videos I make are in English. And so, I mean, I also realize as well, there are ways now of using translators online to convert what my English written research paper into a different language. But there's always, like, you can't go one-to-one directly necessarily between languages. So yeah, so I think, well, then what is the solution? The solution is to publish the same paper in multiple languages, or do you think there's a solution that there should be another language? Or I think, well, on from that, should there be one universal language? Or I also realize it's important to keep separate languages.
Well, it's not an easy question to answer. I think broadening, first of all, learning multiple languages is a good place to start. So if you can read research papers in other languages already, then that helps. So acknowledging this multilingual population, learning multiple languages is one thing. Now AI is making it possible to easily, quickly translate scientific papers and scientific findings in other languages. Some publications are now working towards allowing publication of research in multiple languages, or having editors who can help speakers of other languages edit their papers in a way that meet the standards and the requirements of a journal that publishes in a specific language, for example. Science is definitely becoming more inclusive now than it used to be. Um, I don't know that I have the full answer to it. I think linguistic diversity is the it's the new kid on the block in that way. Really understanding that there is so much knowledge that making it accessible to everyone would benefit the advancement of science and technology. So, for example, when the Chinese scientist who developed, I believe, the treatment for malaria, when she received the Nobel Prize, at that point, only one of her papers, I think, was translated into English. So the majority of English speakers didn't have access to that research. And to this day, there is a lot of wonderful research published in other countries that the wider population doesn't have access to. So we are just becoming aware of that, and there is more online interaction, and not just online interaction between um, countries and people. The world is increasingly becoming a smaller place. So we'll see what happens in the next few generations. I think that the evolution of science, the evolution of knowledge, and the evolution of humanity in the next few years and decades will happen at a speed that exceeds those of the previous generations because of the advancement of AI.
Yeah, no, I really hope so. And well, given that you mentioned AI, I know like a lot of the newer like Chat GPT models, they're built on large language models. I guess the key word there being language. And so, and yeah, I mean, to what extent is there overlap between what these AI systems are doing and what we know as languages?
That's another uh, huge topic that you're approaching. I know that when we bring this up, we think, oh, it's just 2 minute conversation, but there is so much to be said there. Um, so AI right now relies on these large language models, and it is advancing much faster than most people who study language thought they would. Um, it seems that simply learning the probabilities of statistical probabilities of something occurring together has enabled language models to learn and advance very quickly. Of course, they still don't have intentionality, they don't have pragmatic skills yet, they are non organic yet. Um, but there are a lot of similarities and a lot of differences between natural languages and artificial languages. Um, I I talk about this a little bit in the book, and I've been thinking about this since as well. What are the consequences of artificial intelligence for natural languages that humans speak? I think initially we think that it will be a benefit and a wonderful thing to have AI. You and I have just talked a few minutes ago about the fact that AI can translate on the fly text, can translate speech, detect. Just the other day, I was speaking into my um, app, and it would on the fly translate into the other language, detect the language, and translate into the other language that I wanted it translated to. It can help record and preserve dying languages. So we would think, oh, what a great thing and benefit for natural languages. But if we take a longer term view beyond the seemingly immediate benefits, I think that AI will not be a good thing for the diversity of human languages. And what I mean by that is there are over 7,000 languages spoken in the world today. Um, Fewer and fewer every year because speakers of languages are dying, disappearing every few months, every year. And AI, I think, will accelerate the demise of some of those languages. And what I mean by that is only a few languages will really rise to the top. Those that have the largest online footprint and the largest online databases from which these AI models can learn. Because the more information, the larger the base on which an AI model, a large language model can learn, the better that model will become. So there is only a handful. Well, no, there are only a few languages, and it depends, who you talk to. Let's say 20 that have truly, really expansive online presence, and so let's say 20, 200. Let's say however many languages you want to choose, but it's not going to be 7,000+ that will have equally large and powerful models. And eventually, the stronger, the more powerful models, like an invasive species, really will drive out the models that are built on smaller languages that have a smaller online footprint and a smaller database on which those languages are trained, because then those languages won't be as powerful. So, um, I think within a few generations, if things continue in the way they do, we will lose this diversity of languages. And if it is true that language and thought are tightly connected and that language shapes the way we think, then this will also impact the diversity of thought. As many languages disappear, the cultural background, the way of thinking in ways that those languages shape will disappear as well. Um, and, it's almost like a science fiction film where you have increased diversity of human thought, just decreased
Mhm.
diversity of human thought coincide or develop just as this AI models become more and more powerful. So it doesn't bode well to have this increasingly strong, powerful, wonderful artificial intelligence models and then disappearing languages, disappearing diversity of thought for humans. But I don't want to be the doomsday scenario. I think nobody really knows and nobody can predict what will happen. Everyone is making predictions based on their knowledge background, and we shall see. I think the European Union has just recently developed some guidelines for how to proceed with regard to AI. I think other countries will as well, but controlling and developing, it's not something that can be easily um, controlled with laws and rules, because um, you can have individuals or nations that will not follow those rules. So um, it's it's one of the current applied consequences of the psychology of language that we're all interested in, or that I'm interested in.
Yeah, no, I think I think it's definitely right that there are going to be both benefits and consequences that we should be thinking about now, because we just we don't know, right? It's hard to predict. The one, I guess, potential bright side I can give from my side is I have obviously dabbled a little bit with using these ChatGPT models. And I did, as one of my prompts, ask it if we could create a language together. And it was trying to help me come up with our own language, but obviously I realize that's just a bit of fun, and it's hard to, I don't think it's going to be the way to donate necessarily novel languages, but it is, I guess, some insight that maybe we can use these large language models to become more creative ourselves and to bounce ideas that way.
Oh, that sounds like fun, and it sounds like something that I would love to do too. Maybe there is a bit of a psycholinguist in you as well. Um, yeah, it will be interesting to see what happens.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it only reinforces how important the work that you're doing is, to understand like the benefits of languages, the benefits of learning languages, and how it changes the way that we communicate with people and perceive the world around us. So I can only highly recommend my viewers to read your books. I know we've only sort of jumped around and skimmed through many of the topics. And yeah, it's just been amazing to be able to speak with you today.
Thank you. I appreciate you saying that. Interestingly, there are actually two English translations of the book, which we were just talking about, different ways of thinking. There is a US English version and then the UK
Oh,
English
really?
version.
Ah,
Yeah. So whichever language people choose, I hope they enjoy it. I hope they learn a lot. And I refer to it as my love letter to the bilingual and multilingual mind. But really, it's not just for bilinguals and multilinguals. I think people who are bilingual and multilingual will get the most out of it, because there is so little there in the popular science literature written about bilinguals and multilinguals that um, it really just helps get an insight into bilingualism and multilingualism. But it does go beyond natural languages. So I hope people enjoy it, learn a lot from it, and it helps them think about language and mind.
thank you. Yeah, no, I think it definitely will. And also for monolinguals, it definitely encourages you to learn another language. So yeah, no, thank you again for doing this with me today.
It was such a pleasure to talk with you. Good luck with your dissertation defense on Friday
Thank
in
you.
3 days. You'll be a doctor in 3 days, so that's exciting. I've enjoyed listening to many of your videos, so I'm watching many of your videos. So thank you for the work you do bringing science to the wider readership and taking it out from journals and labs to everyone.
Oh, thank you so much.